In the unforgiving mountains of Eastern Europe, where death stalks every shadow, and trust is a luxury no soldier can afford, one woman's split-second decision would rewrite the rules of combat forever. When 5 of the world's most elite Special Forces operatives cornered what they believed was a defenseless target, they had no idea they were walking into the most lethal 90 seconds of their military careers. This is not a Hollywood fantasy. This is not an exaggerated war tale passed down through generations. This is the documented account of Sergeant Elena Kozlova, a 28-year-old reconnaissance specialist whose weapon had been stripped away, whose backup had vanished, and whose only companions were darkness, desperation, and an unbreakable will to survive. What happened next would be studied in military academies, debated in strategy rooms, and whispered about in the shadowy corridors where the world's deadliest operators gather. Because sometimes, when everything is taken from you, you discover what you're truly capable of. The clock started ticking the moment they found her hiding place. 90 seconds later, 5 elite soldiers lay motionless in the snow, and Elena Kozlova had earned a reputation that would haunt her enemies and inspire her allies for decades to come. The mountain air cut through Elena Kozlova's lungs like frozen glass as she pressed herself against the rough bark of the pine tree. 3 days had passed since her unit's helicopter had been shot down over the disputed territory between Moldova and Ukraine, and she was the only survivor. The crash had scattered their equipment across a valley filled with enemy patrols, and Elena had spent every waking moment since then, moving through the wilderness, avoiding capture while trying to reach the extraction point 40 kilometers away. Her rifle, a customized SVD sniper rifle that had been her faithful companion through 2 tours of duty, lay at the bottom of a ravine alongside the twisted wreckage of the helicopter. The explosion had thrown her clear, but not before shrapnel had torn through her left shoulder and embedded itself in her thigh. She had managed to bandage the wounds with strips torn from her uniform, but infection was setting in, and her strength was fading with each passing hour. Elena had been born in Stalingrad, now called Volgograd, to a family of military tradition. Her grandfather had fought at the Battle of Stalingrad during World War II, her father had served in Afghanistan, and her older brother had died in Chechnya when she was just 16. The military was not just her career. It was her identity, carved into her DNA through generations of conflict and sacrifice. She had enlisted at 18, driven by a combination of patriotism and a desire to prove herself in a world that still questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. The training had been brutal, designed to break weak minds and forge steel from those who survived. Elena had not just survived, she had excelled. Her marksmanship scores had broken records, her psychological evaluations had impressed seasoned officers, and her tactical thinking had earned her a place in the elite reconnaissance unit known as the Grey Wolves. The Grey Wolves operated in the shadows, conducting missions that officially never happened in places that did not exist on any government map. Elena had served with them for 8 years, participating in operations across Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. She had learned to speak 6 languages fluently, to survive in environments ranging from desert to Arctic tundra, and to kill with weapons ranging from high-powered rifles to improvised explosives to her bare hands. But all that training felt worthless now as she crouched in the darkness, listening to the sound of approaching footsteps. She had been moving toward the extraction point when she had spotted the patrol, 5 soldiers in advanced tactical gear moving through the forest with the practiced efficiency of elite operators. Their equipment was not standard issue for any of the local militaries. These were professionals, possibly mercenaries or special forces from one of the major powers. Elena had tried to avoid them, circling wide through the dense underbrush, but they had somehow picked up her trail. Perhaps it was the blood she was leaving behind, or the way her injured leg was disturbing the forest floor, or simply the fact that they were very good at their job. Whatever the reason, they had been tracking her for the past 2 hours, steadily closing the distance despite her best efforts to shake them. She could hear them communicating in English with American accents, Their voices carried on the night air despite their attempts at tactical silence. They were confident, almost casual in their pursuit, clearly believing they were hunting a wounded and desperate soldier who posed little threat. Elena had encountered this attitude before, particularly among Western special forces who had never faced an opponent trained in the Soviet tradition of combat. The Soviets had understood something that many modern militaries have forgotten: that war was not a game with rules and referees, but a primal struggle where survival belonged to those willing to embrace their darkest instincts. Elena had been taught to fight not just with weapons and tactics, but with cunning, brutality, and an absolute refusal to surrender. She had been trained to see every object as a potential weapon, every environment as a battlefield, and every enemy as a problem to be solved with maximum efficiency and minimum mercy. She checked her remaining equipment one more time. Her sidearm, a Makarov pistol, had been lost in the crash. Her combat knife was gone, probably buried somewhere in the helicopter wreckage. She had no grenades, no communication equipment, no night vision gear. All she had were the clothes on her back, a small first aid kit, a water bottle that was nearly empty, and a handful of items that most soldiers would consider useless: a length of paracord, a small mirror for signaling, a tube of camouflage paint, and a multi-tool that included pliers, a small blade, and a file. The footsteps were getting closer now, and Elena could make out individual voices. The team leader was giving quiet instructions to his men, positioning them for what they clearly expected to be a simple capture operation. They had no idea that they were dealing with someone who had spent years learning to turn disadvantage into opportunity, to transform weakness into strength. Elena's mind raced through the tactical situation. 5 opponents, all armed with advanced weapons and body armor, moving through familiar terrain with obvious confidence in their superior firepower and numbers. Under normal circumstances, any rational military doctrine would recommend surrender or evasion. But Elena Kozlova was not bound by normal circumstances or rational doctrine. She was a gray wolf, trained to fight until death, and she had no intention of allowing these 5 soldiers to take her alive. She began to move with careful precision, every step calculated to minimize noise while maximizing her positioning advantage. The forest around her became not just terrain to traverse, but a weapon to be wielded. Every tree, every shadow, every depression in the ground became part of her tactical arsenal. She was no longer a wounded soldier fleeing from superior forces. She was a predator preparing to hunt. The transformation was both mental and physical. Her breathing slowed and deepened, flooding her system with oxygen while calming her nervous system. Her vision seemed to sharpen, picking out details in the darkness that had been invisible moments before. Her hearing became acute, filtering the natural sounds of the forest from the artificial sounds made by her pursuers. Most importantly, her mind shifted into the state that her trainers had called the wolf mind, where emotion disappeared and only cold tactical calculation remained. Elena had killed before, but always from a distance with a rifle, always as part of a larger military operation with clear objectives and rules of engagement. This will be different. This will be personal, intimate, and absolutely without mercy. She would be fighting not just for her mission or her unit, but for her life, and she intended to make sure that when the sun rose over these mountains, she would be the one walking away. The first soldier appeared in her line of sight, moving carefully between the trees with his rifle raised and ready. He was good, she had to admit, maintaining proper spacing from his teammates while advancing with tactical awareness. His equipment was first-rate: advanced body armor, night vision goggles, a suppressed assault rifle with multiple attachments. Under different circumstances, Elena might have respected his professionalism. But circumstances were not different, and respect was a luxury she could not afford. As she watched him approach her position, Elena Kozlova began to plan the death of 5 elite soldiers, knowing that she had approximately 90 seconds to execute the most important tactical operation of her life. The clock was about to start ticking, and when it stopped, either she would be dead or they would be. The first soldier stepped into the small clearing where Elena had deliberately left traces of her passage. She had spent precious minutes arranging the scene, scattering drops of blood, disturbing the undergrowth in a pattern that suggested she had stumbled and fallen before continuing her desperate flight. The deception was designed to draw them in, to make them believe they were closing in on a wounded and exhausted quarry who was making increasingly careless mistakes. Elena watched from her concealed position 15 meters away, noting every detail of her opponents. The lead soldier was tall and lean, moving with the confidence of someone who had conducted similar operations many times before. His teammates were spread out in a loose formation, maintaining visual contact while covering different angles of approach. Their discipline was impressive, but Elena could see the subtle signs that they were treating this as a routine manhunt rather than a life-or-death combat situation. She had positioned herself in a depression behind a fallen log, using natural camouflage and the camouflage paint from her kit to blend into the forest floor. Her injured leg was throbbing with pain, but she had learned long ago to compartmentalize physical discomfort during operations. The infection in her wounds was making her feverish, but fever could be an asset in combat, sharpening reflexes and dulling inhibitions. The second soldier appeared, moving to flank the clearing from the opposite side. Elena could hear him communicating through his radio headset, reporting their progress to the team leader. Their tactical communications were professional, but relaxed, lacking the tension that should accompany the pursuit of a potentially dangerous opponent. This overconfidence would be their first mistake, and Elena intended to exploit it ruthlessly. She began to implement the tactical philosophy she had learned from her most influential instructor, a scarred veteran named Colonel Volkov, who had fought in 3 wars and survived situations that had killed entire units. Volkov had taught his students that conventional military tactics were designed for conventional military situations, but that real combat was often unconventional, chaotic, and decided by factors that could not be taught in any manual. When you are outnumbered and outgunned, Volkov had told them during their most intensive training exercise, you must become something your enemies do not expect and cannot prepare for. You must become their nightmare, not their target. Elena had internalized this lesson through years of increasingly dangerous missions, but she had never faced a situation where it was so literally a matter of life and death. She was alone, wounded, and armed with nothing more than improvised weapons and her training. But her enemies had made a crucial error. They had assumed that these disadvantages made her weak, when in fact they had forced her to become exponentially more dangerous. The third soldier moved into position, and Elena could see the fourth approaching through the trees. The fifth, presumably the team leader, would be coordinating their movement from a position that allowed him to observe and direct their actions. This was standard small unit tactics, and Elena had studied such formations extensively during her training. She knew their strengths, their weaknesses, and, most importantly, she knew how to turn their own professionalism against them. She began to move, not away from her enemies, but toward them. This was the most counterintuitive aspect of her plan, the element that would catch them completely off guard. Every instinct they had developed through years of training and experience would tell them that a wounded, unarmed soldier would try to escape, to put distance between herself and superior forces. They would not expect her to attack, particularly not with the calculated aggression she was about to unleash. Elena's first target would be the soldier who had moved to the far side of the clearing, the one who was currently isolated from his teammates by the terrain and vegetation. She had studied his movement pattern and identified the route he would most likely take as he continued his sweep of the area. There was a natural choke point about 30 meters from her current position, where the undergrowth formed a narrow corridor between 2 large boulders. She moved through the forest like a ghost, using techniques she had learned not from military manuals, but from Siberian hunters who had taught her to stalk prey across terrain that offered no concealment. Every step was placed with perfect precision, every movement calculated to minimize disturbance of the natural environment. She had become part of the forest itself, invisible and deadly. The sound of breaking branches announced the approach of her target. Elena positioned herself behind one of the boulders, controlling her breathing and heart rate through meditation techniques that had been adapted from ancient Cossack traditions. Her body was perfectly still, but her mind was racing through the sequence of actions she would need to execute with flawless timing. The soldier appeared in the narrow passage, his rifle raised, and his attention focused on the path ahead. Elena could see that he was scanning for signs of her passage, looking for the blood trail or footprints that would indicate which direction she had gone. He was professional and methodical, but he was also expecting to find a fleeing enemy, not one who was about to attack from within arm's reach. Elena struck with the speed and precision of a predator taking prey. Her left hand clamped over his mouth, cutting off any sound he might make, while her right hand drove the small blade from her multi-tool into the base of his skull. The technique was one she had learned from studying anatomy texts and practicing on training dummies, designed to sever the spinal cord instantly and silently. The soldier went limp immediately, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. Elena caught both the man and his rifle before they could hit the ground, lowering them silently into the undergrowth. The entire action had taken less than 3 seconds, and she was already moving toward her next target before the soldier's nervous system had finished shutting down. She now had a weapon, but more importantly, she had demonstrated to herself that her plan was feasible. The psychological effect of this first successful kill was crucial to everything that would follow. She had crossed the threshold from hunted to hunter, from victim to predator. The fever from her infected wounds was making her feel disconnected from her body, as if she were watching someone else carry out these actions. But she recognized this as an advantage rather than a handicap. The dead soldier's rifle was an advanced American weapon system, equipped with sophisticated optics and accessories that Elena was familiar with from her intelligence briefings. She quickly checked the magazine and confirmed that it was fully loaded, then examined the soldier's equipment for anything else that might be useful. His radio headset would allow her to monitor their communications, and his night vision goggles would give her a significant tactical advantage. As she put on the night vision equipment, Elena could hear the other members of the team calling for their missing comrade. Their voices carried a note of concern now, the casual confidence beginning to give way to professional wariness. They were starting to realize that something was wrong, but they had no idea how wrong things were about to become. Elena moved through the forest with her new equipment, feeling more like herself than she had since the helicopter crash. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, the weight and balance reminding her of thousands of hours of training and dozens of successful missions. The night vision goggles turned the dark forest into a green-tinted landscape where every detail was clearly visible. She could see the remaining 4 soldiers now, their positions illuminated by the infrared signatures that their equipment could not hide. They were converging on the location where their teammate had disappeared, their formation tightening as they prepared to investigate. This was exactly what Elena had hoped for, drawing them together so she could engage multiple targets in rapid succession. The team leader was barking orders now, his voice carrying an edge of anger and concern. Elena smiled grimly as she listened to their increasingly frantic communications. They were beginning to understand that they were no longer hunting a wounded refugee, but she doubted they had any idea of just how dangerous their situation had become. She positioned herself on a small ridge that overlooked their projected route, using the elevation advantage to maximize her field of fire. The shot would need to be perfect, taking out the most dangerous opponent, while positioning her to engage the others before they could react effectively. Elena checked the rifle's settings one final time, adjusted her breathing, and prepared to demonstrate why the Grey Wolves were considered among the most lethal soldiers in the world. The second phase of her counterattack was about to begin, and the remaining 4 soldiers had no idea that they were walking into the most deadly minute of their military careers. The team leader emerged from the tree line first, his rifle sweeping in controlled arcs as he advanced toward the position where their comrade had vanished. Elena could see through her stolen night vision equipment that he was moving with increased caution now, his body language reflecting the growing awareness that their simple manhunt had become something far more dangerous. Behind him, the other 3 soldiers maintained their tactical spacing while closing in on what they believed was their missing teammates' last known position. Elena had chosen her firing position with the cold calculation of a chess master planning several moves ahead. The rocky outcropping gave her elevation advantage and clear fields of fire in multiple directions, while the dense vegetation provided concealment from return fire. More importantly, the terrain would channel her enemies into predictable movement patterns, allowing her to engage them sequentially rather than simultaneously. She chambered a round in the captured rifle and settled into a firing position that her instructors would have recognized as textbook perfect. Years of training had made the mechanics of marksmanship automatic, freeing her conscious mind to focus on tactical considerations. The fever from her infected wounds was actually helping now, creating a state of hyperfocus that eliminated distractions and sharpened her reflexes to razor precision. Through her night vision scope, Elena watched the team leader signal his men to spread out and begin a systematic search of the area. They were good soldiers following proper tactical procedures, but they were operating under the fatal assumption that they were hunting a single wounded opponent rather than being hunted by a predator who had spent years perfecting the art of killing at close quarters. The clock in Elena's mind began its countdown as she selected her first target. Not the team leader, despite his obvious importance to their unit's command structure, but the soldier who was moving toward a position that would give him the best angle to engage her current location. In any firefight, the most dangerous enemy was not necessarily the most senior, but the one best positioned to kill you. Elena's crosshairs settled on the center of the soldier's chest, just below the ceramic trauma plate of his body armor. The shot would need to be perfect, striking the narrow gap between his chest and arm protection with enough precision to cause immediate incapacitation. She had made similar shots dozens of times during training exercises, but never under these circumstances, never with her own life hanging in the balance of a single trigger pull. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm she had learned in sniper school, each exhalation steadying her aim while her heart rate dropped to the optimal zone for precision shooting. The world around her seemed to slow down, every detail becoming crystal clear while everything outside her immediate tactical focus faded into irrelevance. This was the state her instructors had called the bubble, where time seemed to stretch and impossible shots became merely difficult. The rifle bucked against her shoulder as she fired, the suppressed weapon producing only a soft cough that was immediately swallowed by the sounds of the forest. Through her scope, Elena saw the soldier spin and fall, his weapon flying from his hands as the high-velocity round tore through his lung and heart. He was dead before he hit the ground, but his teammates did not yet realize what had happened. Elena was already moving as the brass casing from her first shot hit the ground. The fundamental principle of sniper warfare was never to fire twice from the same position, and this principle was even more critical when facing multiple opponents who would rapidly triangulate her location once they understood they were under attack. She sprinted along the ridge line toward her second firing position, covering 30 meters in less than 10 seconds despite her injured leg. The remaining 3 soldiers were beginning to react to their second casualty, their voices tight with controlled alarm as they reported the contact. Elena could hear the team leader trying to establish what had happened while simultaneously directing his men to take defensive positions. They were responding exactly as their training had taught them, seeking cover and attempting to identify the threat, but they were still thinking like hunters rather than prey. Elena's second shot came from a completely different angle, fired from behind a cluster of pine trees that had not existed in their previous threat assessment. This time, she targeted the soldier who was attempting to establish radio contact with their command structure, recognizing that cutting off their communications would prevent them from calling for reinforcement or extraction. The round struck him in the neck, severing his carotid artery and dropping him instantly. Now the survivors understood that they were facing a skilled marksman rather than a desperate refugee, but they still had no idea where the shots were coming from or how many opponents they were facing. Elena could hear the panic beginning to creep into their voices as they tried to coordinate a response to an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. She was moving again before they could react, this time descending from the ridge to ground level, where she could use the thick underbrush for concealment. The night vision equipment she had taken from the first soldier gave her a massive advantage in the darkness, allowing her to move with confidence while her enemies were essentially blind. She could see them clearly while remaining invisible, the predator's ultimate advantage. The team leader was shouting orders now, trying to establish a defensive perimeter with his 2 remaining men. Elena could see that he was a veteran, his tactical responses showing the kind of experience that came from surviving multiple combat deployments. Under different circumstances, he might have been able to rally his unit and mount an effective defense, but circumstances were not different, and Elena had no intention of giving him the time he needed to organize a counterattack. Her third shot was the most difficult, requiring her to engage a moving target through dense vegetation while maintaining complete silence. The remaining soldier was attempting to flank her presumed position, moving through the undergrowth with admirable stealth despite the chaos that had consumed his unit. Elena tracked him through her scope for several seconds, calculating his probable route and selecting the optimal intercept point. When she fired, the soldier was mid-stride, his weight committed to a step that would never be completed. The round caught him in the temple, killing him instantly and sending his body tumbling into a ravine where it landed with a crash that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that followed. Now there were only 2 survivors, Elena and the team leader. She could see him through her scope, crouched behind a tree trunk with his rifle ready, scanning desperately for a target he could not locate. His tactical discipline was impressive, maintaining proper cover while attempting to acquire the threat that had decimated his unit in less than a minute. Elena found herself respecting his professionalism even as she prepared to kill him. But the team leader was no longer thinking like a hunter. The rapid elimination of his men had forced him into a defensive mindset, reacting to threats rather than creating them. Elena recognized this psychological shift because she had been trained to exploit it, to use an enemy's survival instincts against them by forcing them to make predictable defensive choices. She began to stalk him through the forest, using every technique she had learned during her years of special operations training. The wound in her shoulder was bleeding again from the exertion, and her injured leg was screaming with pain, but she pushed these concerns aside with the mental discipline that had been beaten into her during countless training exercises. Pain was temporary, death was permanent. Elena circled wide around the team leader's position, approaching from an angle he would not expect while maintaining complete silence despite the challenging terrain. She could hear him breathing hard, the sound of a man who was beginning to understand that he might not survive the next few minutes. His radio crackled with incoming transmissions from his command post, demanding status reports that would never come. When Elena finally had him in her sights, she paused for a moment to study her final opponent. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that suggested military academy training rather than enlisted service. Under different circumstances, they might have been allies, professional soldiers serving similar causes in different armies. But circumstances were not different, and Elena Kozlova had long ago learned to separate personal feelings from tactical necessities. She lined up her shot with the same cold precision she had used on the others, her crosshairs steady on the center of his chest. The team leader never saw it coming, never had a chance to return fire or call for help. One moment he was scanning the forest for his invisible enemy, and the next he was falling backward with a look of surprise frozen on his face. Elena remained in position for several minutes after the shooting stopped, listening for any signs that other enemy forces might be approaching. The forest was silent except for the natural sounds of wind and wildlife, no indication that anyone else was aware of what had just transpired. 5 elite soldiers had entered these woods confident in their superior numbers and firepower, and now they were all dead, killed by a wounded woman with improvised tactics and capture equipment. As she finally rose from her firing position, Elena felt the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by the crushing exhaustion that always followed intense combat. Her wounds were bleeding freely again, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each heartbeat. But she had survived, and more than survived, she had demonstrated something that would be studied and debated in military circles for decades to come. Elena Kozlova had just proved that in warfare, as in life, victory belonged not to the strongest or the best equipped, but to those who were willing to become more ruthless than their enemies could imagine. She had 90 seconds to kill 5 elite soldiers, and she had needed only 87. Elena knelt beside the body of the team leader, her hands working methodically through his equipment despite the tremors that were beginning to affect her motor control. The infection in her wounds was spreading faster now, her body temperature spiking as her immune system fought a losing battle against the bacteria that had invaded her bloodstream. She had perhaps 12 hours before sepsis would kill her more surely than any enemy bullet, but 12 hours was an eternity in operational time. The dead soldier's radio was still receiving transmissions from his command post, voices speaking in clipped military English demanding status reports, and expressing growing concern about the loss of contact. Elena listened carefully to their communications, her intelligence training automatically analyzing their procedures and attempting to identify their organizational structure. They were definitely American special operations, probably a joint task force operating under NATO auspices in the disputed border region. More importantly, the radio traffic revealed that the 5-man team had been part of a larger operation involving multiple units spread across a 50-kilometer area. Elena was not out of danger. She was simply between immediate threats. The clock was ticking on multiple levels now, with enemy reinforcements potentially en route, while her own physical condition deteriorated by the hour. She stripped the team leader's body of everything useful: ammunition, medical supplies, communications equipment, and, most critically, his GPS unit and tactical maps. The maps revealed the full scope of the operation she had stumbled into, a complex multinational effort to locate and capture what appeared to be a high-value target operating somewhere in the border region. The implications were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. According to the intelligence documents she found in the team leader's pack, the target was a former Soviet weapons scientist named Dr. Dmitry Volkov, the same man who had trained Elena during her early years with the Grey Wolves. Colonel Volkov had disappeared from official records 3 years ago, but these documents suggested he was very much alive and in possession of information that multiple governments considered invaluable. Elena felt a cold shock of recognition as she studied photographs of her former instructor. Volkov looked older, more haggard than she remembered, but his eyes still held the same calculating intelligence that had made him such an effective trainer of special operations personnel. If he was indeed operating in this region, it explained the massive military response and the quality of personnel they had sent to find him. The realization that she might not be the only gray wolf in these mountains changed her entire tactical situation. Elena had been trained never to abandon a fellow operative, and Volkov was more than just a colleague. He was the man who had taught her most of the skills that had kept her alive through 8 years of increasingly dangerous missions. If he was in trouble, she had a duty to help him, regardless of her own desperate circumstances. Elena began moving through the forest with renewed purpose, using the captured GPS unit to navigate toward the coordinates that appeared most frequently in the enemy communications. Her wounds were throbbing with each step, and she could feel her strength fading, but she had endured worse conditions during training exercises that had been designed to push human endurance beyond normal limits. The GPS revealed that she was only 15 kilometers from the primary search area, a remote valley where multiple enemy units were conducting systematic sweeps for her former instructor. Elena realized that she had been incredibly lucky to encounter only a single team. The overall operation involved nearly 200 personnel from various special operations units, a massive commitment of resources that suggested Volkov possessed something of extraordinary value. As she moved through the darkness, Elena found herself remembering the lessons that Volkov had taught her about asymmetric warfare. He had been a veteran of conflicts ranging from Afghanistan to Chechnya, and his tactical philosophy had been shaped by decades of fighting against superior forces. When you are outnumbered, he had told his students, you must think like a virus, not like an army. You must infiltrate, adapt, and strike from within. The radio she had taken from the team leader continued to provide valuable intelligence about enemy positions and movements. Elena could hear the growing concern in their communications as the missing team failed to report their status. Soon they would dispatch search parties to investigate, and those searchers would discover the bodies of 5 elite soldiers, killed with a precision that would send shockwaves through their command structure. Elena reached a ridge line that overlooked the primary search area just as dawn was breaking over the mountains. Through her capture binoculars, she could see enemy positions spread throughout the valley below, teams of soldiers conducting methodical searches while helicopter patrols swept overhead in complex patterns. The level of resources being deployed was unprecedented for a single fugitive, confirming that Volkov possessed information of extraordinary strategic value. She settled into a concealed observation position and began studying the enemy deployment, looking for patterns and weaknesses that might allow her to penetrate their perimeter. The tactical challenge was immense. Even at full strength and with proper equipment, infiltrating such a heavily defended area would have been extremely difficult. In her current condition, wounded and exhausted, it seemed almost impossible. But impossible was a word that had been systematically removed from Elena's vocabulary during her years of special operations training. She had learned to view overwhelming odds not as barriers to success, but as problems to be solved through creativity, determination, and absolute ruthlessness. The deaths of the 5-man team had proven that she still possessed these qualities despite her physical deterioration. As she watched the enemy forces below, Elena began to formulate a plan that was so audacious it bordered on suicidal. Rather than attempting to avoid the massive search operation, she would infiltrate it, using the chaos and confusion of their own activities to mask her approach to wherever Volkov was hiding. The plan required her to essentially become invisible while moving through an area saturated with highly trained soldiers. But Elena had been taught techniques for exactly this type of infiltration. The key would be timing. Elena could see that the search teams were operating on a strict schedule, rotating in and out of assigned sectors at regular intervals. There would be brief windows when certain areas were unobserved, moments when she could move between defensive positions without being detected. The trick was to map these windows accurately and then execute her movements with flawless precision. Elena spent 2 hours studying the enemy deployment, using her intelligence training to identify command relationships, communication procedures, and tactical patterns. The operation was being coordinated by what appeared to be an American colonel, but with significant input from officers representing at least 4 different nations. This kind of international cooperation suggested that whatever Volkov possessed was considered vital to global security. Her radio intercepts revealed that the search teams had found evidence of recent human activity in several locations, but no direct contact with their target. Volkov was still free, still evading the massive manhunt, which meant he was probably using the same survival techniques he had taught his students years ago. Elena found herself smiling grimly at the thought of her former instructor leading 200 elite soldiers on a chase through terrain he knew better than anyone alive. As the sun climbed higher, Elena began her descent into the valley, moving with the careful patience of a predator stalking prey. Every step was calculated to minimize noise and visual signature, every pause timed to coincide with the movement pattern she had observed from the ridge. She was no longer Elena Kozlova, wounded refugee. She was a ghost, moving through the enemy's domain without leaving a trace. The first checkpoint she encountered was manned by 2 soldiers who were clearly bored with their assignment. They were scanning their assigned sector with the mechanical efficiency of professionals performing a routine task. but Elena could see that their attention was focused on distant threats rather than immediate ones. She passed within 20 meters of their position, invisible in the morning shadows, her breathing controlled and her movement absolutely silent. Elena's infiltration of the search perimeter represented the culmination of years of training in techniques that most military personnel never even learned existed. She had been taught to move through hostile territory not as an invader, but as a natural part of the environment, indistinguishable from the landscape itself until the moment she chose to strike. As she moved deeper into the valley, Elena could feel her strength continuing to ebb, but she also felt something else. The cold satisfaction of a professional operating at the peak of her abilities despite impossible odds. She had already killed 5 elite soldiers with improvised weapons and tactics. Now she was about to demonstrate that the Grey Wolves had been trained to accomplish missions that other Special Forces units would consider beyond human capability. Elena Kozlova was no longer just trying to survive. She was about to rescue the man who had taught her everything she knew about warfare, and she was going to do it by walking through the middle of the largest special operations deployment in the region's history. The next few hours would determine whether she was as good as she believed herself to be, or whether her confidence would prove to be a fatal delusion. Elena found Colonel Volkov in a cave system that did not appear on any of the tactical maps she had studied. He was exactly where his own training would have predicted, hidden in terrain that offered multiple escape routes while providing natural concealment from both ground and aerial surveillance. The old soldier was thinner than she remembered, his hair completely gray now, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him legendary among Soviet special operations personnel. Elena Kozlova, he said quietly as she emerged from the shadows at the cave entrance. I heard the shooting last night. 5 men dead in 90 seconds, all precision kills. I knew it had to be one of my students. Elena felt a wave of relief that had nothing to do with finding safety and everything to do with reconnecting with the man who had shaped her into the weapon she had become. Volkov examined her wounds with the clinical detachment of someone who had treated battlefield injuries countless times, his weathered hands gentle despite their obvious strength. You are dying, he stated matter-of-factly while cleaning the infected wounds with antiseptic from his medical kit. 12 hours, perhaps less, before sepsis kills you. But 12 hours is enough time to complete our mission. Elena looked at him with confusion. Our mission? Volkov smiled grimly. Did you think I was hiding from these people? I have been drawing them into this valley for 3 weeks, concentrating their forces in terrain of my choosing. They believe they are hunting me, but I am preparing to hunt them. Your arrival simply means I now have the partner I needed to complete the operation. As Volkov worked on her wounds, he explained the true scope of what was happening in the mountains. The International Task Force was not just searching for a fugitive weapons scientist. They were attempting to recover a cache of experimental weapons that Volkov had hidden years ago, devices that represented the culmination of decades of Soviet research into asymmetric warfare technologies. The weapons were designed for situations exactly like this, Volkov told her, his voice carrying the weight of decades of military experience. Small, portable devices that could allow a single operator to defeat vastly superior conventional forces. I hid them here because I knew that someday Russia would face enemies who could not be defeated through traditional military means. Elena understood immediately. The weapons cache was not just a collection of experimental devices. It was a strategic asset that could change the balance of power in any conflict where it was deployed. No wonder multiple governments had committed such massive resources to finding it. Control of those weapons could mean the difference between victory and defeat in future conflicts. Why reveal this to them now? Elena asked as Volkov finished treating her wounds. The medical attention had helped, but she could feel the infection continuing to spread through her system. Time was running out, and she needed to understand what role she was expected to play in whatever plan her former instructor had developed. Volkov's expression grew darker. Because they have taken something that belongs to me. My daughter, Katerina. She was working as a cultural attaché in Vienna when they grabbed her 2 months ago. They believe they can use her as leverage to force me to surrender the weapons cache. Elena felt a cold fury building in her chest. The International Task Force had committed the ultimate violation of operational ethics by targeting the family member of their objective. It was the kind of action that transformed a military operation into a personal war, and Elena understood why Volkov had been preparing such an elaborate trap. 200 soldiers, Elena said, reviewing the intelligence she had gathered during her infiltration. 4 helicopter gunships, advanced surveillance equipment, and coordination from at least 4 different special operations units. Even with experimental weapons, we are massively outnumbered. Volkov nodded, which is why we will not fight them directly. We will use their own strengths against them, turning their coordination into chaos and their advanced equipment into liabilities. You killed 5 of their elite operators using improvised tactics and capture weapons. Now I will show you what becomes possible when improvisation meets cutting-edge technology. He led Elena deeper into the cave system, through passages that had been carved by ancient underground rivers and modified by human hands over decades of use. The caves were part of a network that extended throughout the mountain range, offering concealment and mobility that no surface-based operation could match. Elena realized that Volkov had been preparing for this confrontation for years, perhaps decades. The weapons cache was hidden in a natural chamber that had been converted into a sophisticated armory. Elena stared in amazement at devices that looked more like science fiction than military hardware. Electromagnetic pulse generators small enough to carry in a backpack, acoustic weapons that could incapacitate targets at long range, and, most impressively, active camouflage systems that could render a person virtually invisible to both human observation and electronic surveillance. Soviet weapons science was decades ahead of anything the West developed, Volkov explained as he began selecting equipment for their mission. We understood that future conflicts would not be won by the side with the most tanks or the biggest bombs, but by the side that could adapt most quickly to changing tactical situations. Elena examined the active camouflage system, marveling at the sophistication of the technology. The device was surprisingly light, consisting of a flexible fabric embedded with millions of microscopic sensors and display elements that could reproduce the visual patterns of the surrounding environment. When activated, it would make the wearer nearly invisible to anyone more than 50 meters away. "How do we retrieve your daughter?" Elena asked, understanding that this was the ultimate objective of whatever plan Volkov had developed. "They will have her heavily guarded, probably at their main command post." Volkov smiled with the expression Elena remembered from their most challenging training exercises. "We do not retrieve her. We force them to bring her to us. And we do that by giving them exactly what they think they want, a chance to capture the weapons cache and the man who created it." As Volkov outlined his plan, Elena began to understand the full scope of his tactical thinking. The massive search operation was not just looking for a fugitive. It was an elaborate trap designed to draw enemy forces into terrain where their advantages could be negated and their weaknesses exploited. Every aspect of the deployment that Elena had observed was being turned against them through careful manipulation of their own procedures and expectations. The plan required Elena to return to the valley floor and begin systematically eliminating enemy personnel, but this time using the advanced weapons and camouflage systems that would make her effectively invisible. Her attacks would be precisely calculated to create maximum confusion and panic, forcing the enemy command structure to consolidate their forces in defensive positions that Volkov could target with the most devastating weapons in his arsenal. "You understand that we will probably not survive this operation," Volkov said as Elena prepared to don the active camouflage system. "The odds against us are overwhelming, and your medical condition is deteriorating rapidly. This is essentially a suicide mission with a very small chance of success." Elena checked the charge on the electromagnetic pulse generator and verified the settings on her new weapons systems. The familiar ritual of pre-mission equipment checks helped calm her nerves while focusing her mind on the tactical challenges ahead. She had always known that her military career would probably end with her death in some remote location, fighting odds that no rational person would accept. "Colonel," she said, using the formal address that acknowledged both his rank and her respect for his tactical judgment. 5 elite soldiers thought they were hunting a wounded woman last night. They discovered they were wrong. Today, 200 soldiers believe they are conducting a manhunt for an aging weapons scientist. They are about to discover that they are the ones being hunted. Elena activated the camouflage system and watched with fascination as her body seemed to dissolve into the visual static of the cave walls. The technology was even more sophisticated than she had expected, automatically adjusting to changes in lighting and background patterns while maintaining perfect optical invisibility from any angle. As she prepared to leave the cave and begin the most dangerous mission of her career, Elena felt the familiar cold focus settling over her consciousness. She was no longer Elena Kozlova, dying woman. She was an instrument of warfare, precisely calibrated to accomplish a specific tactical objective regardless of personal cost. Within the hour, the International Task Force would discover that their hunt for a Soviet weapons scientist had become something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. They had come to these mountains believing they were facing an aging fugitive with obsolete equipment and no tactical support. Instead, they were about to confront 2 gray wolves armed with weapons that represented the cutting edge of asymmetric warfare technology. Elena Kozlova had killed 5 elite soldiers in 90 seconds using improvised tactics and captured equipment. Now she was about to demonstrate what became possible when a master of special operations warfare was given access to weapons designed specifically to defeat overwhelming conventional forces. The next few hours would determine whether the Grey Wolves' reputation for accomplishing impossible missions was justified, or whether Elena and Volkov would join the ranks of operators who had pushed their luck too far and paid the ultimate price. The hunt was about to begin again, but this time, Elena Kozlova would not be the prey.